Thank you. I wanted to ensure that you had a chance to see the video because it describes in ways that words cannot adequately set out for you the magnitude of the issues that the residential school legacies are playing in the lives of Indigenous people across the country. And those of you who are involved in working with families and working with individuals in programs relating to healing and relating to family wellness know exactly what I'm talking about. And perhaps, though, the one area that we have failed to have an adequate understanding of is the implications that this history has for those who are still carrying around the burdens of the past. In the short time that I have left to you, and I'd like to speak a little bit about what the lessons are of the TRC and what the residential school experience and the survivors who've spoken to us have taught us about the importance of healing and about the importance of reconciliation and moving forward, and also what it's taught us about what reconciliation doesn't include, because there are many things that are disclosed not just in that video but elsewhere in the presentations and in the information around the legacies of residential school that we need to keep in mind as we go forward. The question that we're always asked is, what is reconciliation and what does it mean and how does it work? And let me begin by saying that reconciliation means many different things. When we first started out doing this work as commissioners, we had a think session in which we came up with all the possible definitions of reconciliation and where it would apply and what it could mean. And I think we came up with over 100 different working definitions. And then we asked some of the elders who speak the languages across the country to tell us in their language what word would capture the essence of reconciliation. And many of the elders and language speakers who talked to us said, well, it depends on what you're talking about, because sometimes it can mean about putting things back the way they used to be, or sometimes it means overcoming an injury or overcoming some damage. And sometimes it can mean, and they would use a word about putting things back into balance, dealing with the fact that things have happened to put things out of balance. We, as a working definition at the Commission, we have chosen the idea of balance as an approach to reconciliation that we think probably makes the most sense, because many survivors have spoken to us about the fact that the experience in the schools, whether they were traumatized through physical and sexual abuse or not, has taken them out of a more balanced relationship with their families, with their communities, with their culture, with their language, with themselves, and with the rest of Canadian society. So that what they're trying to achieve is that internal balance in order for them to be able to feel whole again, to have some self-respect and pride, while at the same time being able to establish the kind of relationship with others in this country that they feel is a proper relationship and a relationship of respect. That's a long-term issue for individuals, we know, but in the short term, we acknowledge that there's probably a lot that we can and should be doing. And for those agencies that are working with individuals and families, the question that you always have to ask yourself is what works and what needs to be understood about this. There's a growing area of study called epigenetics that we always commend people to take a look at, because the field of epigenetics is the field in which they talk about the implications for the behavior of our DNA and our genes caused by historical trauma or individual trauma. And scientists are now beginning to understand that the way that your genes behave or your DNA behaves can be impacted by personal trauma in your life. And the implication of that is that behavior can be passed from generation to generation. And that might help us understand the importance of residential school experience and trauma in the lives of individuals as well as in the lives of family members, members of the same family, knowing that there has been an ancestor that's gone to residential school, but that nobody recently has gone to residential school doesn't mean that you can dismiss residential school experience, therefore, and that you always need to factor that into thinking and look at the question of what implications it might have for behavior. So I think the most important initial step that we have to take a look at is the whole question of uh, understanding what the experience of that individual and his or her ancestors have had with trauma in residential schools or trauma generally, because one of the issues that's come out of residential school that many intergenerational survivors have talked to us about is that their parents may have experienced trauma in residential schools, but they experienced trauma in the home from the actions of the survivors. And that becomes an issue of ongoing legacy for the residential school survivors' children. And we need to ensure that we therefore have an understanding of that. A reconciliation initially, therefore, needs to be considered in the context of the individual and what is it that an individual needs in order to be able to come to terms with that past, to come to terms with the impact of the past. And that means that they need to, or you as a professional working with them, need to have a good understanding of what the residential school experience of their in their lives has been. In the criminal justice system, for example, there's a requirement that judges, before sentencing an individual, have to have an appreciation for the unique circumstances of the individual Aboriginal offender. And that means that reports have to be prepared which take into account the historical background of the individual before a judge can do the sentencing properly. And it's not about sentencing somebody to a lighter sentence, it's about developing an appropriate sentence that takes into account those kinds of factors. And right now in the criminal justice system, Aboriginal people are grossly overrepresented, and the criminal justice system is not doing its work properly in that area to address those needs, to prevent those high incarceration rates from happening. But the same is also true in the child welfare system. In the child welfare system, we know that Aboriginal kids represent about 50% of all of the kids in care in Canada today, and that the number of Aboriginal children in care is far in excess of what the number of Aboriginal kids who were in the residential schools ever were. But the implications of that for the individual, for the child, are that a child is being taken from a family environment and from a community environment, and often being placed in a culturally inappropriate environment with foster family members or foster placements that may not be of the same cultural background as the child, and may not be able to keep the child's family contacts and family awareness alive as well, which for young children may not be as important as they will be later on when the child starts to develop a sense of identity and a sense of need to answer the question of where they come from, and they want to know what their family background has been. Child welfare system historically has attempted to hide the fact that children are adopted or have been removed permanently from their family from the child, but that's no longer the course of action that most child welfare agencies take, and it's because of the experience has been that children need to know that, children want to know that, and the overall well-being of the child is often better fulfilled if the child is informed of that all along and aware of that background information, because the nature of a permanent foster relationship or an adoptive relationship is going to be different than the nature of a natural family relationship. That being said, however, for people who are working in the field of individual treatment and family counseling and therapy, it's important then to have that background information. It's important to know what the research is telling us about what works and what needs to be considered when you're dealing with providing services to families in that situation. And it's important to try to keep um, a focus on addressing that historical trauma as it's occurring or as it's reflecting in present day behavior. The criminal justice system knows they have to do it. They're not doing it well. I'm not sure that the child welfare system knows it should be doing that as well, but um, it needs to be brought uh, to that point where it accepts that responsibility. Those of you who've read the summary report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will see that our first set of recommendations, in fact, are aimed at the child welfare system because we see the growing apprehension of Aboriginal children and the inappropriate cultural placements of them into foster homes and institutions as the largest single problem that needs to be addressed at this point in time, probably exceeding the problem that we're seeing with the incarceration rates in the criminal justice system. All of that's a reflection, of course, of the historical legacy of residential schools and the trauma that's occurred, a lot of which you will have had a chance to familiarize yourself with, not only in the materials that we've produced at the TRC, but in the many other publications now that have come out about that. But what's really important is the science and the professional academic information and material that's growing out there. Ultimately, the issue of reconciliation, I think, is most important for the family. We can talk about reconciliation at the community level between individuals in the same community. We can talk about reconciliation being important at the national level between Aboriginal nations and Canadian government and provincial governments. But I think before we can even get to those discussions, we need to recognize that there is a real need for families to come to their own process of reconciliation because they are the one institution of permanence that is going to have the most important long-term impact on the evolution of Aboriginal communities and therefore the growth of those communities. We have listened to survivors and their statements. We've recorded 7,000 video statements. We've heard from many others, in addition to the statements that have been given at the during the claims process, another 30,000 of those statements as well, in which survivors have talked about the impact that the schools had upon their lives and the fact that they went on to harm those in their families who they were responsible for, whether that's their partners or their children or their grandchildren or their nephews and nieces, and extended family members as well, that many survivors are very concerned about the fact that before they leave this earth, they want to engage in a process of reconciliation, including forgiveness and apology with the members of their own family. And that's important for their own sense of well-being, their own sense of mental strength and emotional strength, spiritual strength too. And we're not creating opportunities for that to happen because I think that's also important for the children of survivors. We've had many intergenerational survivors talk about the fact that they now understand why their parents are the way they are. You heard the young girl on the video talk about now she understands why her dad drank so much. But it goes beyond mere understanding. It goes into the question of, can we now use this information to strengthen our relationship with each other and to re-establish good, strong families, as historically had always been the case. And I think from the perspective of those involved in family wellness, you need to take into account the impacts of residential schools upon family dynamics and upon family behavior, particularly by survivors, because it isn't just about the violence that the survivors brought into the family relationship. Many intergenerational survivors talk about the lack of intimacy, the lack of love, the feeling of distance between themselves and their parents, the lack of understanding and appreciation for what their parents experienced in the schools also contributed to a great deal of anger towards their parents for their parents' lack of appropriate behavior. And so that anger, it manifests itself in distant behaviors, manifests itself in mistreatment of elders and mistreatment by intergenerational survivors of themselves and their own families. So coming to terms with that is going to be a long process. We need to understand that residential schools have been with us and were with us for almost 7 generations, about 125 years. And that long-term impact means that we have to look at the long term in order to involve ourselves in a reconciliation process that's going to be meaningful. We're not going to solve this overnight. And we need to understand that taking the long-term approach means that we have to accept that there will be stumbles along the way and that there will probably be an evolving sense of what's going to work and what's not going to work. And what's going to work for one family may also not work for the other, because the one answer that many people have developed is that we need to go back to the culture and go back to the language. But Christianity is very strong among some indigenous families and some indigenous communities. And we can't just say to get rid of the churches and get rid of Christianity and go back to our own traditional cultures, because that'll be rejected by a lot of people in the communities. And if it isn't rejected by everybody, then it'll create more division and more conflict. That's part of what we need to come to terms with. Where does all of this go, and how does all of this fit together now into the future? And we have real challenges as a society, and those challenges are not just for Aboriginal people, but they're for Canadian society as well. Because the one thing we need to understand is that while Indigenous children were being mistreated and were being shamed and demeaned, called pagans and savages in the residential schools and told that they were inferior, that same messaging was going on in the public schools as well. So we have raised for many generations individuals in Canadian society, in the non-Aboriginal community, who have come to believe in Aboriginal inferiority, but have also come to believe in the inherent superiority of European cultures and European nations. And that message also needs to be corrected, because the falseness of that is a cause for division within our society as well. All people in Canada need to appreciate that all of Canada, all Canadians have been impacted by the residential school policy and the messaging that went on in those schools. And so we need to begin our national reconciliation process by recognizing the importance of education as the potential healing tool that it can be. It was the use of education that got us into this mess, and it's going to be education that I think ultimately is going to get us out of it. But we need to take a holistic approach to the way that we educate our children. Children have a way of being able to deal with each other in a fair and just way when they're little. It's when they're growing older that mistreatment of children begins to manifest itself among them, and we need to figure out a way to ensure that they don't fall into those habits that we perpetuate as adults. And so teaching our children how to talk to and about each other in a more respectful way is ultimately, I think, going to be the key to reconciliation in the future. And reconciliation in that context is about healing this country as well. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be part of your day. I apologize for not being able to be there with you. And if you have time, and if we can manage it, I don't know how great the facilities are, but if you can manage, I'd be willing to answer questions from your floor. Yep, sure. Now remember, I can't hear them, so you'll have to repeat it. Thank you. Um, we have issued, as you all know, we issued a summary of our final report in June of this year. And since that point in time, and even before that time to a certain extent, but since the release of the summary report in June, we have been quite overtaken by the efforts of institutions, organizations, and individuals across the country to select those recommendations that target the groups that they are involved with and commit to utilizing those calls to action in their particular spheres. So, for example, we had a number of recommendations about the legal community, and in particular the education of lawyers and the professional development of lawyers across the country. All of the deans of the law schools have gotten together and have undertaken to look at the way that they educate lawyers in law schools. And a number of law schools across the country have committed to ensuring that Indigenous law is a mandatory course of education in law schools. The Law Societies of Canada have gathered recently in their national meeting with the Federation of all of the law societies to agree that they will ensure that rules and protocols around the practice of law by established lawyers are addressed so that all lawyers who are involved in those areas of litigation or those areas of legal work involving Indigenous people take some professional development before they can hold themselves out as being individuals who can do that area of law. So professional development instruction is going to become mandatory for lawyers. We have met with a number of child caring agencies who've indicated that they are looking at the way that they do their work, but not as many as I would have hoped that we would have been able to address. We've had discussions with the university presidents across the country. The university presidents have all, through their national body, indicated that they are endorsing the calls to action that we made towards universities of ensuring that all professional faculties at all post-secondary institutions require that all students in those professional faculties are required to take a course of study in Aboriginal history and in particular around residential schools and the implications that that history has for those who are practicing in those fields. We've also had discussions with the medical community, nurses and doctors, through their professional associations have indicated that they are prepared to undertake cultural competency training for people in those medical professions. We have a resolution that's being developed with the Canadian Medical Association calling upon all of the provincial medical bodies to ensure that doctors are required as part of their professional development and medical schools as part of their professional education of doctors provide that sort of education as well. We've had a number of discussions with political units at the municipal level. The big city mayors, for example, who are the mayors of all of the large cities in Canada, have passed a resolution endorsing the calls to action for changes in the way that cities do their work. And you've seen action, I think, in some of the major cities across the country. Edmonton, for example, Vancouver, Prince Albert, Regina, Halifax, Winnipeg, Toronto, have all passed some resolution or other endorsing the issue of reconciliation and undertaking to change their policies and practices and to work towards developing a better relationship with Indigenous people. So I think that the report itself is, and the calls to action that we've issued have had an impact already. And I think that we have seen as well during the last federal election a strong commitment by the incoming government that they will do what they are able to do within their sphere of influence and responsibility to implement the calls to action that we have placed on the lap of the federal government. Now, we have called upon the federal government to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to establish a national council for reconciliation that has the ability to monitor all reconciliation initiatives across the country. We've also called upon them to issue a royal proclamation on reconciliation and to develop a reconciliation compacts with all of the Aboriginal entities so that they change the way that they do business. And one of the elements of the call to action that we issued with regard to the federal government is that the federal government should establish a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people instead of approaching the question of Indigenous people as a program issue. And finally, we also issued a call to action calling upon the federal government to support the initiative to establish a royal commission into the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I'm very hopeful that that's going to happen as well.